Just to go over a bit of an overview of the presentation this evening, I'll be covering a little bit of discussion on what are dynamic display signs as we have come to term them. We'll talk a little bit about the history of the discussion before the Council and the Planning and Zoning Commission. We'll talk also, I'll touch on the prior or what would be the current city code standards as it relates to illuminated signs within the city prior to the emergency ordinance that the Council passed in September. We'll also discuss a little bit on the research at the top that was conducted by staff and the Commission previously. Some of the features or elements of emergency ordinance 2012-19 that was passed by the Council on September 4th. As well as the work of the Dynamic Display Subcommittee and recommendations, and then finally the consideration of the ordinance that's before you this evening. So to provide a little bit of background on the topic of discussion this evening, dynamic display signs are generally any sign that is capable of displaying words or symbols, figures, that can be changed electronically or mechanically by remote or automatic means. And these take a variety of shapes and forms, both within our community as well as in others. They range from a more typical form of those, or maybe the earlier versions were just monochromatic signs that included generally text and non-graphic elements. But they also more commonly and more recently have taken the shape or form of LED-type dynamic displays that are capable of displaying text or graphics or full motion video depending upon the display type. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, from full-scale billboards to smaller scale displays. The Council or the City has recently seen an increase in the installation of these types of signs over the course, certainly the last 3 to 4 years. There are 14 that are currently in existence in the community, and of those, 8 were permitted in the last 3 years' time. Our office had conducted research on the topic for inclusion in an coming update of the city's zoning code that's been termed the Unified Code Project. And the Planning and Zoning Commission more recently discussed the topic after a recent dynamic display installation and transmitted a letter to the Council on July 12th of last year, I should say. The Administrative Committee of the Council received the Commission's letter on August 13th of last year and recommended the Commission be directed to develop standards for this type of signage, and that the City Council consider an emergency ordinance in the interim stage. The full Council received that report and recommendation on August 20th of last year, and at that meeting the Council made a finding of imminent peril and directed staff to prepare an emergency ordinance for consideration during a notice public hearing that was to be held on September 4th of 2012. On that evening, the Council adopted Emergency Ordinance 2012-19 that we'll talk about a little bit later, which established some interim standards for these types of signs and directed the Planning and Zoning Commission to develop permanent standards for the Council's consideration. Following the Council's action, the Planning and Zoning Commission formed a subcommittee, a 7-member subcommittee to prepare a recommendation for the Commission's consideration. And on October 3rd of last year, that subcommittee conducted its first meetings and continued to meet almost weekly for the next 3 months, concluding its work on December 5th of last year. On December 12th, the Planning and Zoning Commission received the subcommittee's recommendations and directed staff to schedule an ordinance that reflected those recommendations for consideration during a public hearing on January 9th of this year. The Commission conducted that hearing and made its recommendation to the Council that we'll discuss here shortly, which leads us here to this evening. Certainly, anytime we are discussing signage, there are conflicting interests. We have business entities that wish to be visible and advertise sales and specials, and we also, communities are also concerned with aesthetic character of the community and commercial corridors, visual clutter, and distraction of passing motorists. So there oftentimes are conflicting interests when we're looking at the issues of signage. Prior to the adoption of the emergency ordinance, Moscow City Code identified the variety of signs that were permitted in different zoning districts. Some of those may be permitted to be internally illuminated, and some are externally illuminated, typically in lower intensity, whether they're neighborhood business or residential districts. Only externally illuminated signs, it would be those that maybe have a floodlight that is cast on the sign, are permitted. And then as you move into more intensive commercial zoning districts, internally illuminated signs are generally permitted. Moscow City Code also states that no strobe lights, flashing lights, rotary lights, or beacons are permitted. but currently the code, prior to the emergency ordinance, made no distinction between an LED type sign or a traditional internally illuminated plastic face sign. As I mentioned, staff researched and surveyed 13 other communities, looking at their sign ordinances and how they addressed these types of signs. That list included Meridian, Eagle, Haley, and Lewiston in Idaho, Pullman, Spokane, Seattle, and Washington, Bend, LeGrand, Hood River, and the Dalles in Oregon, and Missoula, Montana, and Sheridan, Wyoming. The conclusion of that research indicated that there are a variety of standards and regulations for this type of signage. 7 of the 13 communities permitted dynamic display signs. That maybe should be reduced down to 6 of the 13 with respect to some recent articles that were in the press related to the city of Pullman, which had traditionally permitted those signs and then have recently changed, I guess, their determination of how they were going to be classifying those signs and have deemed that they will no longer permit those underneath their existing code. So Pullman was included in one of the 13 that was previously identified as being permitted dynamic display signs. 6 of the 13, or maybe 7 of the 13, prohibited those types of signs within their community. And of those that permitted the dynamic display signs, common standards include zones within which these types of signs were permitted, which are generally limited to commercial or more intensive zoning districts. The size of the dynamic displays that they were permitted, those may include maximum square footage of the dynamic display or a percentage of the total sign area, and those did vary depending on the community. Brightness standards were often addressed, but there was a great variety in the method and the standard by which they were managed. Dynamic elements were often addressed, including kind of minimum display duration, animation and transition time, as well as a few other items. This is a table that's included in your packet that summarized those, and I can't read that on the screen here this evening. As a recap, in looking at location, as I mentioned, most communities limited the dynamic display signs to commercial districts, and some prohibited them within historic and downtown areas. With respect to size, 3 of the 7 that permitted them did not have specific size limitations, while the remaining 4 had maximum dynamic display limitations, often including a maximum square foot limit and a percentage of the total sign area, whichever was less. In looking at brightness, as I mentioned, there were a variety of standards. 4 of the communities had specific brightness standards, most of which only for nighttime. There's only one, I believe, that had a daytime standard, and many of them all use different forms of measurement, whether those are watts, nits, or foot candles, which are all different methods of trying to manage the brightness of this type of display. There are a variety of professional association recommendations regarding these, and there are some reports and studies that are included in your packet this evening. The Illuminating Engineering Society of North America recommended a maximum of 100 nits at nighttime in urban areas to limit that contrast ratio between a dark roadway environment and a well-lit sign. The Outdoor Advertising Association of America suggested a recommendation of somewhere between 300 to 350 nits for nighttime brightness. This is actually kind of an extrapolation from a foot candle standard that organization was promoting, which is really their recommended method, and we'll talk a little bit about the different methods of measuring the brightness of these types of displays. As we looked at dynamic elements, 5 of the 7 communities had minimum display duration standards, and those ranged a great deal from 2 seconds to 1 hour in certain instances. Some prohibited animation, others allowed animation, some controlled transition method and duration between messages, so there really were a variety of standards that were incorporated there as well. As part of our research, we also researched what state standards were in existence, and the Idaho Transportation Department does have standards that were adopted through the IDAPA rules, 390360, that govern outdoor advertising along the state's highway corridors. Generally, that would be for the city of Moscow, the state highways of Highway 8 and Highway 95, which include both North and South Main Street and the Washington-Jackson corridors, as well as the Troy Highway and the Pullman Highway. They have standards, and they use the term variable or multiple messaging signs, and those standards included a prohibition upon animation or moving images, a minimum message display duration of 8 seconds, a maximum transition time of 2 seconds, some general language related to brightness, but more specifically just prohibiting glare upon the traveled way, and They also had language in their standards related to prohibiting interference with a traffic control device or signal. As I mentioned, we have 14 that were identified in an inventory that exist within the community today. The vast majority of those tend to be at the 45 square feet or so or under. There are a couple that are larger than that. The University Inn display sign is 74 square feet in size, and the Tri-State display sign is 192 square feet in size. With the exception of those two, most all are, like I said, Rosars is indicated down below at 54 square feet in size. But that gives you kind of a idea of the signs that currently are in existence and their size. The commission, as well as the task force, also kind of looked at comparison of size with respect to scale of an individual person, ranging from 49 square feet, so roughly 50 square feet on the left-hand side of the screen, moving to 100 square feet to 150, to approximately 200 square feet and 300 square feet in size. But to kind of give you kind of a scale of what 50 or 100 or 150 or 200 looks with respect to a person. As we looked at brightness standards, there are a variety of methods, and really probably two that are the most often utilized. Include either a measure of luminance, which quantifies the surface brightness of the sign, and that is generally measured in nits or candelas per square meter. And the second is illuminance, which quantifies the amount of light which falls upon an object that is often measured in foot candles. Typically, if you're measuring the brightness of a illuminated sign like this, a nit, a method of measuring a nit would take a nit gun. You would get up in close proximity to the face of the sign, and you would take a measurement of that sign either on or while it's displaying a message. As you look at the foot candle measure, you would actually take a light meter and you would move some distance back from the face of the sign, and you would turn the sign off, and then you would turn it back on, and you would kind of measure the relative increase in brightness in the area. The nit standard is kind of an absolute brightness of the face of that sign, where the foot candle is kind of the relative amount of light that gets cast on that on a particular location at some distance from that sign, and it looks at more of an incremental increase of light above and beyond the ambient lighting that may exist in that location. There are benefits, and there was a fair amount of discussion both with the subcommittee and the Planning and Zoning Commission about what would be the best method, and you'll see here that the subcommittee felt that a combination of the two would be best. Potentially the foot candle method works best in an area where it's a fairly dark setting. So there's a sign south of town that is kind of an example of that, where you're looking at relative brightness increase. So if the sign is if it's in a dark setting, then the sign would have to be relatively dimmer or less bright to have the same proportionate increase than if the sign was located in a well-lit area. The other benefit of potentially the nit standard was that as ambient lighting increased in the area, a sign's brightness could increase over time as well. Or you could have one sign installation where it is limited to a certain brightness, and then the next sign that gets installed under the foot candle measurement might be allowed to be brighter because it's now taking into consideration the ambient light cast by that first installation. And so you could have some of an escalation element where the nit is just an absolute at the sign's face, regardless of what else is in the setting, may be a preferred method in an area that is well lit already. There were some common comparable nit measurements. The direct sunlight was 5,000 to 7,000 nits based upon the reference you looked at, as well as a typical computer monitor was somewhere between 200 and 400 for an indoor computer monitor. And so those were kind of some comparable numbers. As I mentioned before, the Council on September 4th passed the emergency ordinance that adopted the interim standards. That emergency ordinances allow the Council to pass ordinances without Planning and Zoning Commission review and with any abbreviated hearing notice that the City Council finds practical. It is allowed only if the governing board finds that there's an imminent peril to the public health, safety, or welfare that requires the adoption of the emergency ordinance, and it can only be in effect for 182 days. With the passage of the ordinance and the publication date, I think that results in the current emergency ordinance being in effect until March 9th. And often they're utilized where there's a concern that public discussion on the topic may result in a rush to secure permits under existing rules that may be viewed as being more permissive as what may be coming at some point in the future. Looking at Emergency Ordinance 2012-19 that was passed by the council, it included the definition of a dynamic display sign within city code. It identified that those signs were permitted only within the motor business, the general business, and the industrial zoning districts within the city. It limited any single dynamic display sign to no more than 100 square feet in size, and it included operational standards with respect to brightness, which was established at 5,000 nits during the day and 500 nits at night, which was a sample ordinance that we found from Missoula, Montana. It included a minimum message display duration of 5 seconds, a maximum transition time of 1 second. There's a portion in the ordinance that relates to a display malfunction. If there's a sign that's malfunctioning, it has to be turned off within 24 hours of notice from the city. And it also prohibited certain types of displays, blinking, bursting, flashing, those that would be likely addressed underneath the existing sign code language that prohibits those types of strobe lights or other activities on a sign. It also, under a section under nonconformities, would apply the operational standards that were identified to existing dynamic display signs to the extent that was technically feasible in consideration of the operational capabilities of that sign. So the display duration, the transition, the prohibited type of displays of flashing would all apply to both pre-existing as well as future sign installations.